Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those here in-house, we would ask that courtesy to see that our mobile devices of various sorts have been silenced or turned off. And for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Leading our discussion today is Darren Baxt, Research Fellow in Agricultural Policy in our Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. He studies and writes about agricultural and environmental policy, property rights, among other issues, and his agriculture portfolio covers agricultural subsidies, trade, as well as food policy issues. Before joining us here, he was a policy counsel for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Previous to that, he served as Director of Legal and Regulatory Studies for 7 years at the John Locke Foundation of North Carolina. Please join me in welcoming Darren Baxt. Darren?
Thank you. John, thanks everybody for coming today and those watching online. So when I talk to farmers and ranchers, and I've been talking to a lot of them recently, there is one issue that they care about more than anything, I think, and that's trade. So it's not surprising that the NAFTA renegotiations are certainly drawing their attention, and they're definitely paying attention right now. The agriculture community, kind of the mantra that they keep speaking about is first, do no harm. That's something that Sonny Perdue, the USDA Secretary, also has been saying to the White House. Agriculture trade helps the nation's farmers and ranchers by giving them access to more customers for their products. And many of those customers are in Canada and Mexico. Canada is the United States' largest ag export market, and Mexico is the third largest. But it's not just the exports that are important, it's the imports as well. Imports are extremely valuable to the U.S. Families in the U.S. have much better access to higher quality and less expensive agricultural products than they had in the past, especially when we look at fruits and vegetables. And Mexico and Canada are a primary source of those imports. Quite simply, agricultural trade with Canada and Mexico is critical for America's farmers, ranchers, and families. So there's a lot at stake in these NAFTA renegotiations, and that's kind of the title of today's program. The game plan for today is that each of the panelists will provide some short remarks, and then we'll have kind of a quasi-fireside chat of some kind, and then we'll have a discussion with all of you in the audience about these issues. I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists right now, and much briefer than they probably deserve a much longer intro, but I want to keep it short. It's important to really understand the extent of agricultural trade with Canada and Mexico. So our first presenter, Brian Riley, is going to provide this overview. Brian Riley, is right here in the middle, is the director of the Free Trade Initiative at the National Taxpayers Union. And it wasn't that long ago, I think maybe 4 days ago or something, that Brian was a colleague of mine here at the Heritage Foundation, where he was a senior policy analyst in trade policy for like 7 years here at the Heritage Foundation. I really appreciate Brian coming back today and traveling so far to come over to Heritage. It's also really important to highlight some of the concerns that the agricultural community has and other countries, Mexico and Canada, might have regarding some of the objectives that have been outlined in the USTR trade objectives. One of those concerns is something called the seasonal provision that's been discussed. So what is this provision and why is it a concern? So Yochai Basebird, who is right here next to me, will address that very important issue. Yochai is a partner in Denton's international trade practice in Washington, D.C., and leads the global law firm's U.S. trade team in matters around the globe. His diverse international trade and customs practice focuses on counseling U.S. and foreign companies, U.S. trade associations, and governments in a variety of international trade matters globally. He has represented U.S. and foreign agriculture producers in its trade remedy proceedings in the U.S., Mexico, China, Ukraine, and South Africa. He is recognized as a leading international trade and customs practitioner. Finally, what are the practical implications of this seasonal provision? But also, how do the trade negotiations even work? What are the practically does it work? And how do the countries implement any of the agreements? Well, Ambassador Darcy Vetter, who's at the far end, will provide us some insight on these questions. Darcy is a strategic consultant working on international trade, food, and agricultural issues. She currently serves as diplomat in residence at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she's working to launch the Clayton Yeiter Institute in International Trade and Finance. She certainly has the expertise to inform us about the trade negotiation process because she served as Chief Agriculture Negotiator at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative from 2014 until January of this past year. Ambassador Vetter also served as Deputy Undersecretary for Farm and Foreign Agricultural Services at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So at this point, Brian, can you take it away for us?
Thank you. I'm going to speak from the podium to make sure I can control the short PowerPoint presentation I have to accompany my remarks. Darren, thank you. It's nice to be back at the Heritage Foundation. I did remember to silence my cell phone before I came up to the podium. These little guys, for those of you who may not know, that's Yorkshire pig. And this is a topic that's very important to me because before I was a trade policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation or went to the National Taxpayers Union, we had my dad, Jack Riley, and his friend Gary Alley started a Eureka Valley, Yorkshire pig farm outside of Manhattan. And as these pigs paid my way through college, basically. That's outside of Manhattan, Kansas, by the way. So I'm going to speak really big picture about trade and a little bit about agricultural trends in general, and let our other speakers go into a little bit more specifics, and then hopefully be able to contribute some specific answers to questions you may have. But before getting into the specific provision of a topic of negotiation in a trade agreement, just as a background, trade is something that's been important for Americans since before our founding. You go back to the Boston Tea Party when colonists didn't appreciate paying taxes on imported tea, and their response was to declare their independence. And you can't really read this, but the line before, maybe you can, before imposing taxes on us without our consent in the Declaration, is that the king, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. So keeping our markets open is something that's been an important part of U.S. history. And sometimes when I'm talking to groups, I'll ask, especially students, I'll have them guess what the first U.S. free trade agreement was. And sometimes they'll say NAFTA or the U.S.-Canada agreement, or some smart aleck will know the name of some treaty from the 1800s that we had. But I was hoping, and sometimes I get it, that they would refer to the U.S. Constitution, which was created in large part so we could have free trade between the 13 colonies, then states, or the 50 states that we have today. So our trade agreements are not just about cutting tariffs or technical ag principles, but they're really about expanding freedom and prosperity. And the Index of Economic Freedom, which the Heritage produces every year, shows really just strikingly that the countries that are most prosperous around the world are those that are most open to international trade and investment. So the next few slides I've got, I'm not going to linger on too much. They're just to give an idea of the importance and direction of trade. That's overall U.S. exports and imports for agricultural goods. Exports have increased about 2.5 times since the turn of the century. And if you're a farmer or rancher, on average, about a third of U.S. farm and ag income comes from exports, and it's a share that's been growing over time. It's something that's much more important to agriculture even than all the federal farm subsidies combined. you see the trends are almost exactly the same there for U.S. trade with ag trade with Canada and Mexico, been increasing significantly. And as Americans, it's pretty easy to understand that exports are good, they create jobs, they bring us income, but imports are also good. I had my winter jacket on walking over today, and it's nice to know I could walk up to Giant or across to the corner market and get fresh fruit and vegetables from all over the world. And when NAFTA was first enacted, I remember back in 1993, there was one observer who said, instead of the North American Free Trade Agreement, it should be called the North American Cancer Reduction Agreement, because Americans can help have a better supply of fresh fruit and vegetables from around the world, in addition to having bigger export markets. Darren mentioned in his introduction how significant Mexico and Canada are to our trade. There are a lot of fast-growing markets, but depending on how you count agriculture exports, they're 22 to nearly up to as much as 30% of U.S. ag exports go to North American markets. If we did anything to jeopardize that, I was talking to a group of state legislators in Tennessee the other day, and I gave this same kind of presentation. One of them came up afterwards and said, you know, if we do anything when we lose a market, it's not like we can just get it right back. If we risk losing markets to producers in Brazil or Argentina or elsewhere, it's a challenge to try and recapture that market, which there's no point in us losing in the first place. It's not just one small sector of the farm economy that relies on trade. Many sectors depend on exports. Those are overall exports, not just to Canada and Mexico. But I like this slide because of the title. I talked about fresh fruit and vegetables from Mexico, but the third of our imports are fresh fruit and vegetables and beer. So it's when we import from other countries, we have the freedom to import, get the best products at the best prices. We're better off economically. Our trading partners can use those dollars either to buy U.S. exports or to invest in the U.S. economy. So that's just a big picture of why I think trade is so important to the United States and will continue to be important, and why it's really important. Would be a significant mistake for us to adopt provisions that would make NAFTA less of a free trade agreement and more of a managed trade agreement or something else, and would establish a dangerous precedent going forward. And just to wrap up, I have one final slide, which I think goes back to the idea of trade being an important part of who we are as Americans. If it works. Well, it's not the first time I've had PowerPoint issues, and will not be the last. No. But President Reagan just refers back to the importance of trade, and that trade is a win-win. It's a mistake when we look at it as a win-lose. People use the language of war and refers back to the free trade history of America's founders. So if you can just imagine what it might sound like for him to say that, or email me. My new email is briley@ntu.org. I will send you the clip because it's a really good clip. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Hey, Yohai.
Oh, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here today to talk to you about really an important issue for the U.S. and the global economy, frankly. I'm going to focus on this seasonality provision, and I thought before I get started, I'll do a little bit of table setting. So how does this apply? How would it apply? And how could it affect U.S. purchasers, consumers, businesses, and importers? So if you're a U.S. industry, whether you produce, frozen lemon juice or orange juice, sugar, salmon, mushroom, and you feel like you're being injured by reason of imports that are dumped or subsidized, you can bring a petition to try to get remedial duties put in place, whether they're dumping duties because the imports are priced at a level that's below their quote-unquote normal value, or if you want to challenge subsidies that you think a foreign government is providing that industry. you file the petition, and the first thing you do is you head over to the U.S. International Trade Commission, and basically in their analysis, the very first thing they do is decide what is the domestic-like product. What product are you competing against? So you define the scope of the case, and I'll use a concrete example. Back in 2001, there was an industry in California, the spring table grape industry, that was harvesting grapes in California in April, May, and June, so very narrow window, and they filed a case. And the Department of Commerce initiated a case against spring table grapes from Mexico and Chile. So the ITC has to decide, well, what do those grapes compete with, right? So they start with the subject merchandise, April, May, and June harvested grapes, and they decide what U.S. industry produces that product. And they look at a few factors. These are called the domestic-like product criteria, things like physical characteristic, uses, customer purchaser perceptions, the interchangeability between products, and sometimes price, depending on the case. And based on all those factors, the ITC tries to define what is the like product. And then once it defines the like product, it says, okay, the U.S. industry are all producers of that like product. Yeah, pretty straightforward analysis. Where you get into a challenge is trying to look at that over the course of generally a 3-year period, which is the period that analysis takes place. And there have been a couple examples historically in the U.S. where a U.S. industry has tried to narrowly define agricultural product in particular based on a season or a part of the year. So the one example I mentioned is the spring table grapes from Mexico and Chile in 2001. Another earlier case from the 80s was fall harvested round white potatoes from Canada, which is making its way up my list of favorite trade case names. Up till now, it's been golf carts from Poland and above ground swimming pools from Japan and clothespins. But I think fall harvested round white potatoes are going to make it into my list now. In that spring table grape from Mexico and Chile, the ITC went negative at the prelim, which is actually extraordinarily rare. And the reason they did that is they said, look, we have certain criteria that the statute tells us we have to look at, the ones I mentioned in terms of use, physical characteristic, perception, price, et cetera. And while we can take into account seasonality in a product that's perishable, that doesn't in and of itself change the overall criteria. And so in the US market, people buy grapes all year round. And so we're not going to define the like product as just those California grapes that are harvested in April, May, and June. We're going to define the like product as all grapes that had the same other characteristics that were the subject merchandise. And because of that, they went negative. In the fall harvested round white potatoes from Canada case, I mentioned, they did find that seasonality was important, but there, the potatoes were actually sold all year round. Potatoes have a much longer shelf life or bag life, or however you want to think about it, than grapes and other fresh produce, and thus it didn't really impact the analysis. But the point is, this seasonality has come up in the context of a NAFTA negotiation. But that case from the early 80s predates NAFTA, and the case from 2001, which happened after NAFTA was entered into force in 1994, that this isn't a NAFTA issue. This is a U.S. trade remedy law issue. And it's, I guess, opportunistic is one way to look at it, that it's being raised in the context of NAFTA, but there's nothing in the NAFTA agreement that precludes, as such, a seasonality approach. It's just the U.S. law in general is written in a way that makes it just a criteria that the ITC applies when defining the like product. So putting aside the NAFTA renegotiation, there's nothing that precludes an industry that is interested in some sort of seasonality approach to go, just up there to Congress and try their luck or their influence to try to get a law to amend Title VII, where our anti-dumping and subsidy laws are, to have a seasonality provision put in. But it's, I think that that's an important distinction that needs to be kept in mind, that it's not a NAFTA-specific issue. It's just NAFTA-related because the industries that are behind this, like tomatoes and some others, are really focused on the Mexican exports to the U.S., which Mexico obviously is a part of NAFTA. There's nothing, there are examples in the law of of distinctions in the like product that are geographic in nature. So if you produce cement in northeast Mexico, cement's heavy, costly to move. The natural market for that was Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and the product didn't really go beyond that. You can bring a like product definition or a regional injury case, to be more precise, that's limited geographically, and U.S. law provides for that. So that's an example of a sort of one way to think of an exception to the general rule that you look at the whole industry across all 50 states for the full year. But a regional injury analysis is something that's well established under U.S. law. I'd point out a couple of other things. There's nothing in the WTO agreements that govern dumping and subsidy cases that expressly deal with this issue of seasonality. There is language that suggests that you should look at injury data over the same time period that you look at dumping and subsidy. And in the U.S., you look at dumping and subsidy over a 12-month period. And so by analogy, you should look at injury over a full 12 months and not a fraction of a year. But it doesn't expressly deal with this issue. So it'll be yet to be determined how far USTR pushes this and how it affects the overall NAFTA negotiations. But it has been something that is highly controversial for Mexico in particular, and I don't think Canada is supportive of the seasonality approach either.
Thanks, appreciate it. Darcy?
Sure. So I'm going to focus my comments largely on the process and how you take a negotiation to a deal that is finalized and then implemented, and why, going back really to Brian's comments, why you have to think about this as growing the pie or creating a win-win rather than a zero-sum game if you want to get to an agreement that can be implemented well. I think there's been a lot of focus on a good deal and what a good deal is, and that this whole process, there might be uncertainty, but don't worry, because the deal will be good in the end. And I think it really behooves us to think about the fact that in a trade negotiation, when you finish the negotiation, that deal is actually the beginning of a process of implementation. It is not the end. It does not set the terms. It does not govern everyone's behavior or what might happen in markets. It creates opportunity then for the private sector using the certainty provided to forge a relationship. And so concluding the negotiation is the start of something. It's not the finish. And I think we've forgotten that in some of the rhetoric that we're hearing around this NAFTA process. And each of the three countries has to complete their own domestic process before whatever negotiation outcome there is actually becomes real in terms of, how it governs trade between our countries. So in the United States, under Trade Promotion Authority, the administration has to take any new negotiated package back to our Congress, who must then approve it and vote those changes into law. The same thing has to happen in Canada or Mexico. And so when a series of proposals are put on the table that are designed to rebalance NAFTA, but the balance only goes in one direction, you don't create very good odds that all three countries are going to be able to support the outcome. And so I see the seasonality provision in particular as one of a set of what a number of trade associations have referred to as the poison pills, or as proposals that might rebalance trade, or again, going back to that idea that a trade agreement is used to balance out trade deficits rather than to integrate economies and create more sophisticated and interconnected supply chains, where they're really designed to stop trade or to refocus trade in particular areas when things seem out of balance. So, for example, a seasonal produce provision might be used to place duties on Mexican produce, which I think the constituencies pushing for that provision to be introduced were focused on that, largely from the southeast United States: tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, berries. But those are, let's remember again, the balance, the political support for these overall agreements and the fact that we have to implement them. Those happen to be the areas for Mexico that have been the symbol of success on NAFTA. And so if you take away the certainty of access to the U.S. market for the largest sector of agriculture that benefits, it undermines a key area of support for continuing that relationship and providing reciprocal certainty to the U.S. products that depend on the Mexican market. And we all have access to current trade remedy laws. They have been used in Mexico on a number of occasions against U.S. products where, again, that political support and balance seemed out of whack. And so creating more opportunities to put in place or to disrupt the certainty of free flow of goods and services will certainly have ramifications, but it would also be hard, I think, to get these negotiations to conclusion and get political support. And that's important for two reasons. One, the data you just saw that Mexico and Canada are always two of the top three agricultural trading partners for the United States, and those aren't necessarily markets that we can afford to lose in any way, shape, or form. And that unlike when NAFTA was negotiated, there's a lot of competition to be the supplier of choice into Mexico and Canada in areas where we kind of took for granted that they would choose us. And we're already seeing wheat from Argentina going into Mexico, corn from Brazil heading into Mexico, Chilean apples on Mexican shelves that weren't there before we started questioning that underlying foundation of our NAFTA relationship. And so the process of negotiation itself, if we don't think about creating an outcome or a path to an outcome that's mutually beneficial, the longer this process goes on, the costlier it becomes for U.S. agriculture. Uncertainty and a lengthy process is costly in and of itself. And because of the global competition that we face and the competitive pricing that our other countries now offer for products where U.S. exports have long dominated, it is not clear that we will get that market share back, even if we end up with a NAFTA that continues that duty-free trade relationship on all agricultural products. So, I think we have to take into account that process and outcome are both quite important here, and without benefits on all three sides, getting to a successful conclusion will be difficult. It's also worth thinking about the fact that the U.S. market is relatively open. Without NAFTA, if we all went back to our MFN tariff rates, or those rates we apply to all other WTO countries, except for dairy and sugar, U.S. tariffs are pretty darn low. Not the case in Mexico, where you have double-digit, in many cases nearing 50% tariffs on a number of the products that we export and that we could then have to pay. And again, depending on what Mexico does in the next few months, could put us at a real disadvantage, again, with those other competitors. The EU and Mexico are nearing conclusion of an update of their free trade agreement. Mexico and Brazil have been actively negotiating for some time and have been somewhat accelerating that process, according to some of those press reports. So our position of preference, if NAFTA goes away, does not necessarily maintain itself. And the last point that I wanted to make is that when it comes to agriculture, tariffs are, of course, a problem. Tariffs on agricultural products worldwide are generally higher than those for manufactured goods. But some of the biggest problems in moving agricultural products are sanitary and phytosanitary measures, food safety, animal health, plant health laws, regulatory procedures that might not align between countries. And it's easier to solve problems in that area for the regulators to work together to see eye to eye about how those goods can continue to flow with trading partners with whom you have deep relationships. And that starts with our FTA partners, because we talk all the time about how free trade agreements get rid of tariffs, but they also create structures for regulators to work together, to notify each other in advance when we have regulatory changes that are coming. And so when I think about what NAFTA is, I think about my first days in the ag office at the U.S. Trade Representative as, a civil servant, knowing that when we had a problem, when goods were just not getting across the border into Canada or Mexico as quickly, that there was always this deep Rolodex of 3 or 4 people that everybody knew in Mexico or Canada that you could call to fix the problem before it became a permanent trade barrier. And so NAFTA is also a living thing. It's a way of doing business. It is a cooperative attitude where you know that 3 countries have made a commitment to being integrated together, and based on that commitment, we'll try to solve problems before they become intractable or damaging to the 3 parties. And so, you know, it has value beyond the numbers and is something that I think it really behooves us to maintain. So.
Thank you very much, Darcy. See, I have a question. So who is driving this seasonality provision? Who's pushing it? And also, how could you see Mexico kind of responding if we keep pushing the seasonal provision?
All right, so you have U.S. Agricultural industries that have, because of nature, limited harvesting windows and highly perishable products. And so they can only be in market for a relatively short period of time and not all 12 months of a calendar year. Mexico has a competitive advantage geographically because they're south of the United States, and for other reasons, that they have a longer growing season and the ability to reach market in the United States throughout the year for many of these commodities. And so what you have are industries like in Florida, and Darcy mentioned some of these in terms of tomatoes and cucumbers and berries and whatnot, that can't be in market the whole year and are competing against products that are in market the whole year. And under a traditional injury analysis, that's hard to make a case of injury because you can't, to the extent you're losing sales and whatnot, it's because you're not in market for the whole time. And so what those growers want to do is maximize what they can make in a very short period of time. But the imports can be in the market for the full time and aren't they're at pricing that doesn't require them to maximize their return in a narrow window because their harvest is much broader. So that's kind of the reason behind it. I think from, won't speak for the government of Mexico, but I think Mexico's perspective is that these laws are meant to deal with unfair trade practices, not geographic and atmospheric and climatic differences. And that is a reality of who has what competitive advantage for different products at different time, and we shouldn't change the laws in a way that narrowly can be applied to deal with these kinds of circumstances where there's no ill intent or effort to dump or subsidize. It's just the nature of different growing seasons.
Thanks. Brian, if some of the growers are saying, well, we can't compete with Mexico, I've actually heard that directly, they would argue less regulation, or they don't have the same type of burden that growers here do. And then in the seasonal context, there's this argument about humidity in Florida is tough, so it makes it tougher for them to compete. How would you respond to those arguments?
Well, U.S. exports, whether it's ag, manufacturing, continue to grow. We're very competitive. I don't think there's any reason that we should think every person should be an island unto themselves and produce everything that they consume. And really, we've all been pretty laid back and calm and professional up here, but it's just outrageous, the idea that somebody sitting a mile that way or a few blocks that way can decide what the price we pay for goods when we go to the grocery store or when we go shopping is. The idea that we're going to empower the government to pick winners and losers based on who has the best lobbyists, who has the best lawyers, that is absolutely antithetical to the idea of what the United States is about. It's antithetical to what the idea of the North American Free Trade Agreement is about. And if you have the opportunity to compete and succeed in the global economy, as many Americans have, that's in large part because of the freedom that we have as Americans, and not the idea where the government's going to come restrict our opportunities and pick winners and losers. It's impossible to favor one group without penalizing somebody else, and that's the opposite direction of where we should be trying to go in our NAFTA negotiations. And this is an important issue, but you go down the list of what we're trying to do in NAFTA, it's just very difficult to see what the ultimate end game is. And I'm going to wrap up by saying, I didn't really understand Darcy's point. I understood it, but I got it about 3 or 4 months ago when we had some young farmers visiting from Georgia. And I thought they might be upset if NAFTA goes away, they would be harmed, or if Mexico retaliated against us on a trade action, they might be harmed. They said, no, we're already losing business. We're already losing business because of what's being done to us in these negotiations.
One of the arguments I've made in Darcy, in a paper I wrote about the seasonality provision, is that you really have one subset of the I guess in the tomato industry, kind of undermining the entire industry itself. I'm just trying to figure out maybe it's just politics, I guess, that plays into that. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. But also, what are the tools that Mexico, Canada can take to kind of push back against the seasonality provision?
Well, first of all, maybe let's start with the tools that have been used to try and address concerns that Florida has had. And they successfully brought forth a dumping case many years ago looking at competition from the Mexican tomato industry and entered into a suspension agreement under U.S. trade remedy law that helped to provide price floors and other conditions for Mexican tomatoes coming north. And so there is a mechanism that would not necessarily change all of trade remedy law or use NAFTA as a vehicle to alter all of trade remedy law for the U.S. To help them address concerns that may be lingering in trade in tomatoes. And that is the suspension agreement, which is due for renegotiation by early March of this year. So it is both a possibility to look at those terms in trade and say if there is unfairness that continues in their view to exist, how could it be addressed? And it's very timely as well. Those negotiations, I think, are just beginning to go forward again. But I think in terms of the tools to address one way or the other, there's formal tools, there are informal responses from governments. I think you should expect more anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases against U.S. agriculture products. And that, in the past, frankly, Mexican pork producers have brought forward petitions to place anti-dumping duties on U.S. product. The poultry industry, U.S. apples, have faced such challenges in the past. But oftentimes when those petitions come forward, the Mexican government says, we're not going to accept them. Or before we go forward with imposing these duties, are there ways we can help to address concerns that you have with the industry, with regulatory hurdles you may be having? Can we work that out before we start that tit-for-tat relationship of you place a duty on my product and I place a duty on yours? And frankly, that's been largely successful. Restraint has been shown before you begin a cycle of wanting to go back and forth. But that will be hard to continue if cases start mounting north of the border for Mexican agriculture. The other piece here is that where there are trade problems, whether they are agricultural in nature or not, because of the success of NAFTA for U.S. agriculture, when the United States is found to be out of step with its trading obligations and the other countries are given the opportunity to then place retaliatory tariffs in place, U.S. ag is always at the top of that list. And that certainly will not change if we put in place other tools that would make it easier for us to be placing tariffs on Mexican products. So if you look to the dispute over country of origin labeling, that of course was largely agriculture in nature, but the list of the candidates for retaliation were broad and deep when it came to agriculture. Mexican trucks. When the U.S. lost its case on providing access to Mexican long-haul trucks, it was wine and Christmas trees and potato products and a number of agricultural products that topped that list that saw retaliation and that eventually created leverage to finally solve those problems because of the economic harm it did. And agriculture is usually on the front lines of those kinds of things. That's no different in NAFTA. And I don't think we want to create a dynamic where those become more frequent and more damaging.
Yeah, if I can follow up, because you mentioned earlier also poison pills. Another proposal that's been tabled by the United States is eliminating what's called Chapter 19 in NAFTA, which is an alternative dispute settlement mechanism if you want to challenge the decision of, like I mentioned, the U.S. International Trade Commission or the Department of Commerce. You go to the U.S. Court of International Trade in New York. But under NAFTA, they created an alternative mechanism that dispute, that appeal, can be heard by a panel of trade experts that are picked off of a roster. And that applies in all three countries. And as Darcy said, it is common for U.S. ag exports to be the tip of the spear, to be the ones who are targeted the first in retaliatory dumping and subsidy cases. And currently, U.S. ag exporters who are caught in these kinds of cases and want to appeal the results of Economia, the agency in Mexico that administers these cases, they can go to a NAFTA panel and have U.S. and Mexican citizens and Canadians listen to that. If they lose Chapter 19, then they're forced to go to Mexican courts. And as somebody who's represented U.S. ag exporters in multiple cases in Mexico, and somebody who's from Argentina and fully comfortable in the civil law system, I'll tell you the last thing an Iowa hog farmer or an Arkansas poultry producer wants to be is in a Mexican court, because it is a very just different system of justice than we're used to. And I'm not saying which one is better, but it is very different and not what people are used to. And the outcomes have actually been very positive for U.S. ag exporters who have appealed dumping and subsidy cases in Mexico in particular. And while the U.S. wants to eliminate Chapter 19 from a defensive perspective, so that cases like softwood lumber from Canada and other cases don't go to a panel and rather are heard by the CIT and ultimately the Fed Circuit, that applies both ways. And so U.S. exporters would lose the opportunity to invoke Chapter 19 when they're targeted by these cases.
I would note, too, that just as the Chapter 19 provision would go both ways, so would the seasonality provision. And I don't think we should forget that nearly 20% of our fruit exports and about 60% of our vegetable exports from the United States go to Canada and Mexico. And once rules are created, they get used. And so there is also a risk that it will be easier to place anti-dumping and countervailing duties on U.S. fruit and vegetable exports that go to our neighbors north and south, whether that's raspberries or onions and potatoes going to Canada, or that's U.S. apples heading into Mexico. So there is a risk within the produce industry, not just of retaliatory or other anti-dumping action coming to other sectors of U.S. ag, like pork or beef or corn or rice. The other thing I think we have to remember is that trade negotiations and what a free trade agreement looks like evolve over time. And once you put a provision in an agreement, it becomes the template for the next one. Not just what the United States does, but all the countries watch each other and see what innovations they develop for how to deal with difficult issues in trade. And so if you look at the way we deal with labor and environmental issues in trade agreements, templates from U.S. agreements show up in the way that Europe or that Canada or others start to try and address these common problems we have about relationships between different aspects of our economy and the way that role that trade plays in addressing them. And so the idea that this could be a limited to NAFTA issue, or that it is a NAFTA problem rather than a broad problem, and that it's surgical and contained, I think really discounts how trade policy has evolved over time. So once it's there as an element of that agreement, I think you could see it, frankly, not only used against U.S. produce in Canada and Mexico, but possibly used against U.S. produce with other free trade partners or in future negotiations.
Just a very general question. Just, we're focusing a lot on the benefits to agriculture and ag producers, but just if you have any general thoughts on the importance of ag trade, Canada and Mexico, to consumers here in the U.S., and also what the impact of a seasonality provision or other types of poison pill type of provisions might have on consumers. Because Mexico is certainly the leading kind of importer of U.S. fruits and vegetables to the U.S., and driving up those prices certainly would be problematic, I would imagine. So just any general thoughts you might have before I open it up to the audience.
Well, I think there's a risk when we say consumer, we think of somebody sitting at home just frivolously spending money. And we're talking about things that are necessities for Americans. And we need to, I believe, consider all the transportation jobs we have in the United States, moving goods, not just domestically produced, but internationally. And this idea that trucks should stop at the border, unload, put everything in a warehouse, put it on another truck, move it across the border, unload, put it in another truck, and then take it to where it's going. I don't think that's something that would benefit either consumers or the U.S. economy, among a long list of proposals. What about the people who owe their jobs working at Safeway, feeding Americans, people who work at U.S. Restaurants? It's not just about consumers, it's about jobs. And anytime we try and restrict imports, it's not just that consumers will have to pay more, but that our economy will suffer. And somebody over here, again, might get a job, but somebody here is going to lose a job. So it's not just prices, but it's about jobs, and it's about the ability of us to have a prosperous future.
I think it's also the case that it's not just about price, it's about variety and availability. And so U.S. Consumption of fruits and vegetables has gone up about 14% since NAFTA went into place. And the portion of that is fresh fruits and vegetables, the most healthful fresh food, has gone up as well, although I can't remember the exact figure there. But we eat better because we have access to year-round supply of these high-quality fresh products, and much of that, of course, comes from our neighbors to the south. But it's also the case that retailers have to be able to supply consumers and create habits in consumers, that we eat more strawberries year-round because we can find them year-round, and we don't think of them as a special occasion food. We think of them as something we have for breakfast. So it really changes consumer behavior. But that means that we're growing more strawberries in the United States, again, getting back to those jobs, because we have the opportunity to import them as well. We have grown demand. The U.S. avocado industry spent years fighting to keep Mexican avocados out, and now understand that it has made them much more prosperous and successful because they can supply a whole U.S. market, and consumption has gone up tremendously. Profits have gone up, not just for those who grow in Mexico, but those who are growing in the United States. They created a new realm of demand that did not exist because there was supply, and supply that was high quality, affordable, and reliable. And so most of, or many of, U.S. produce companies don't really think of themselves as a U.S. company or a Mexican company. They have invested north and south of the border to be able to say, we supply the NAFTA region, and we do so in a way that has deepened our investment, our profits, and the number of jobs we supply in all three areas. And I think if you ask a number of agribusinesses, whether it's in produce or in other areas, do you think of yourself, or do you think of your Mexican, your U.S., and your Canadian operations as separate entities? The answer is really no. They think about overall, how do they meet supply? How do they meet demand? How do they most efficiently allocate their resources to bring profits back to what in many cases are U.S. headquartered businesses that, again, have those multiple and add-on economic effects in the bigger economy?
Well, thanks. Let's hear from you. If you have questions, just raise your hand and tell us your name, where you're from, and ask a question.
Hi, my name is Justin Margolis, the government of Quebec. And question about geographic indicated seasonal products that have geographical indicators. The U.S. and the EU have very different visions of geographic requirements for agricultural products. With Canada going into CETA already in force, Mexico increasing its trade with the EU, the U.S. TTIP negotiations are probably not going forward in the next 3 years. What is the challenges for GIs? And the second question is, with Mexico and Canada both being part of the TPP, the new name for the TPP, during TPP negotiations, Canada was willing to give up more access to its dairy markets and the supply management because they were gaining an access to 12 other countries. On a trilateral, a country is willing to give up less access. So when we talk about the the perceived American withdrawal from the global trading system and how that weakens the U.S. negotiating positions.
Take it that was for me. So that's a really big question. Let me try and zero it in a little bit. I do think that just because the U.S. agenda right now is focused on relitigating or renegotiating the agreements that we have. But even though that is the case for Canada and Mexico engaged in these NAFTA talks, they have not stopped looking at and participating in agreements with other countries as well. And, among the TPP 11, there are 27 separate trade negotiations going on, either amongst those countries themselves or those countries in the EU. It's a pretty active global marketplace out there in terms of forging new alliances and new agreements. And it's a pretty active world in terms of getting access, particularly in the Asia Pacific, to a number of markets that are really dynamic in terms of both overall population increasing and the percentage of that population that is joining the middle class. And of course, when people have extra income in the middle class, the first thing they change is what they put in their mouths, what they eat. And they consume more protein, and they consume more fresh fruits and vegetables. And and frankly, more processed fruits, vegetables, and other ag products, many of which are branded. And when consumers first have access to those products, start to create some of those brand loyalties. That's what they identify with. And so if the United States is not there at the get-go to be a product of choice, because we still face tariffs where other countries do not, that disadvantage will last and be sticky, even if we catch up in tariff terms, because of the relationships, the identity that those consumers have formed when they first started consuming more of those products. And if you look at the TPP 11, you look at Australia and New Zealand and Canada, you look at key producers of beef, of wheat, of wine, and of dairy products that are all key competitors of ours in that market. And those, of course, are all those higher value, high protein products that we're starting to see really take off in terms of consumption into those countries. And with the EU, you have the added complication that they are also exporting, along with their goods, their regulatory regimes through their trade agreements, including what I would say is overreaching recognition of geographic indications that goes beyond recognizing products that are associated with place and into placing those protections on more generic products as well. But exporting those procedures in a way that may not allow us to catch up, even if we were to do a free trade agreement with those countries later, because there would be a whole cadre of dairy products, meats, possibly wines and spirits as well, that we simply would be unable to sell in that market if we gained access at a later date. And so it does matter how and when we choose to engage with these countries. And I think there is a risk that by focusing on renegotiating existing agreements at the expense of forging new alliances, that's actually a problem and a disadvantage we'll be facing for many, many years to come.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that these agreements, whether at the WTO level or regional or bilateral, establish the rules of the road. And if you don't like the rules, then either you get off the road or you advocate to change the rules. And sitting on the sideline allows others to define those rules in a way that might not be advantageous to you. So GIs are a great example of that. The U.S. has a particular viewpoint traditionally on geographical indicators, and the world is not going to just accept the U.S. position. The U.S. has to advocate for that position, where it's important for U.S. industries and the U.S. economy and U.S. interests to do so. And if we're not doing that, others will take advantage of that void and define those rules, because a few things will never change. People will always engage in trade, and people will always seek to have trade advance for their own interest, which is not self-interest necessarily, because it collectively can benefit everyone, just maybe not in the same way, right? There's a line, there are winners and losers, don't get caught on the wrong side of that line. I mean, trade is about the overall aggregate impact on the economy, and these rules of trade apply not just to the narrow topic that they're applying to, but more broadly the relationships and the economic relationships between the countries that are involved in that relationship.
I was just in Tennessee last week, and they reminded me of a few years ago, Audi was looking at building a new factory either in Tennessee, and they wound up locating in Mexico instead of Tennessee. And the officials in Tennessee were reminding me that at the time, Audi said, well, Mexico has twice as many trade agreements as the U.S. does. They were counting every country in Europe as one in that. But the free trade agreement with the EU, so they can bring parts in tariff-free and send their finished goods tariff-free, free trade agreements with countries like Brazil. So there's just a tremendous opportunity for the Trump administration here. In addition to making the kinds of economic reforms domestically that make us a magnet for international investment, but really to recapture the lead in international trade. It's an opportunity that they should take advantage of.
Another question? Okay, right there.
Hi, thanks for the great panel. My name is Lance Youngmeyer with the Fresh Produce Association of the Americas, and I wanted to ask on this seasonal regional definition, is the U.S. trying to push this concept in the new WTO talks? And if so, what sort of shape is that taking? And then the second part of the question is, within the NAFTA talks, Mexico put on a proposal to ask the U.S. to demonstrate how their anti-dumping countervailing duty regime is WTO compliant. How does that play into what we're talking about today?
So I'll handle this first, I guess. I haven't looked at my phone as we've been talking, so I don't know what current U.S. trade policy is because it seems to move rather quickly these days. But I have not expressly seen it mentioned that they were going to table seasonality at the multilateral level at the WTO to try to include that. I would expect there to be significant opposition, but of course that wouldn't stop the U.S. from tabling that. I feel like there's a opportunity that's been, if you want to call it an opportunity, that's been defined of trying to shoehorn this as part of the NAFTA negotiations, because that vote, as Darcy mentioned, will be up or down by Congress when the final package, if there is a final package that's sent up there, so maybe they'll have an opportunity to push this through that way. So I just am not aware of them raising it at the WTO level. And in terms of WTO consistency or inconsistency, it's generally the case when a country or industry loses a trade case in a country that they try to get their host country, their country to challenge it at the WTO, whether it's the U.S. challenging Mexico or Canada challenging the U.S. And so, you know, in general, the people who bring complaints at the WTO are successful, but not always so. So the U.S. successfully defended a dumping case against Indonesia recently and was found to be WTO consistent. So, you know, in general, I think people would say that the U.S. system is consistent with its WTO obligations, but at the margins, there are certain applications that are done and certain decisions that have been found to be inconsistent. So the tabling of reports or analyses as part of the negotiations, I think, is a way for Mexico and Canada to respond to the U.S. demands without ceding any substantive ground on what they see to what they themselves have characterized as outrageous or red lines or poison pills. So they're trying to come up with a alternative to move the discussions along to see if they can move past the friction points that they are right now.
So one more question. You had a question here?
Hi, my name is Ron Campbell. I work with the avocado producers and packers in Mexico, and thank you, Darcy, for giving me the lead in on this. One thing we didn't touch on is immigration, and when the industry first started down in Mexico in 1995, Michoacan, which is the largest state and the largest producer of avocados, their major export was people. There was more workers leaving Michoacan than staying. Right now, the industry represents 75,000 direct jobs and 300,000 indirect jobs. In fact, the industry has grown so exponentially larger, that we're having a hard time finding labor. Not only that, on the U.S. side, with the various multipliers, trucking and distribution channels, it represents the industry in the U.S. represents 18,900 good-paying U.S. jobs. It's $3.2 billion to the U.S. GDP, over $600 million in state and federal taxes paid, and this is a complete NAFTA example. I mean, we got access in 1997. 20 years we've been in the market this year. So it's important to realize that there are so many more layers, to a free trade agreement. And as far as the seasonality provision for avocados alone, without a NAFTA, and Darcy mentioned it, the most favored nation a tariff is 13 cents per kilo, which is $1.60 a box. It's very easy to deal with compared to losing your market for 3 months as a result of some anti-dumping case. So just selfishly speaking, as an avocado industry alone, we'd rather have the 13 cents than the seasonality provisions. And I work very closely with the Mexican government, as you can imagine, and their position is non-negotiable. They're not going to walk away from the treaty, but they're not going to accept that. If anybody's going to walk away, it'd be the U.S., but that's it.
Thanks. Any comments to the comment?
This idea that a company can go to a U.S. agency and say, you need to restrict imports and increase the price Americans pay, or else we're going to file an anti-dumping or a countervailing duty case that might penalize them anymore. And I'm not sure that's not really I'm not sure what the right phrase for that is, but it's not a good way to do business. I'd be a little bit more sympathetic to this. And I see my former colleague Alden Abbott in the front row, so shake your head if I'm wrong. If our anti-dumping laws said, I'm going to use avocados as an example, I mean, very hypothetical. If we could prove, in the U.S. producer, that Mexican avocado growers are organized to sell at a loss, to drive American avocado producers out of business so they could capture the entire market and raise prices through predatory pricing and gouge consumers, then that's something we could have a discussion about. But that's not how our laws work, right? It's just, we think the prices are too low and it's hard for us to compete, so give us a 13% tariff so we can make some more money.
Thank you very much. Thank you, audience. Join me in giving a round of applause to the panel.